Well, buen camino, everyone. Buen camino. Buen camino is the salutation that Tanya and I said dozens of times in the month of June as we were pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago. Buen camino. Or in Portuguese, it's bon caminho. With some other sounds in there that I can't muster. Buen camino. Buen camino is really kind of a universal greeting. It stands in for good morning, good afternoon, good luck, God be with you as you go. And it's exchanged between pilgrims or peregrinos who encounter each other on the way, the camino, the way, buen camino. There was a second word in the Camino lexicon that I discovered along the way, and that is more of an exhortation. And that word is ultreia. You say that? Ultreia. Now, this is how it's spelled. It's a combination of a couple of Latin words, ultra meaning beyond, ia meaning kind of I'm with you. When you add that in Latin, apparently it means together. And ultreia really serves as kind of like a rallying cry between pilgrims. It's basically saying, hey, go further or beyond. Let's go beyond, and I'm with you as you go. And that is an exhortation or rallying cry that's shared between pilgrims who are together transcending what they know and what they think they're capable of. Ultreia. Now, if you don't know, if you've never been on a pilgrimage before, a pilgrimage by design is based on an idea of transcending familiar spiritual and or physical norms. You go on a pilgrimage to go beyond what you think you can do, what you have done before. And ultreia is like the word of encouragement or the exhortation. Hey, come on, or go further. I'm with you. I'm behind you. Now, I didn't learn about ultreia until after Tanya and I had finished the Camino. And so for me, the word ultreia actually struck me more like Santiago's holy exhortation to me for my future beyond the Camino. It was as if God was saying to me at the end of this Camino, hey, Lance, go further. Transcend what you've known before. Go further. I'm with you. Now, I was so struck by this idea that I kind of embraced it as an organizing idea for our staff. And I bought them all this nifty little bracelet to remind them. Ultreia, let's go further. Let's go beyond what we've known before. I'm with you. Let's do this together. Ultreia. Well, today, Chestnut Grove, I'm extending this rallying cry or this exhortation to you. Ultreia. Let's go beyond. Yeah? Let's go beyond the norms that we've known. Let's transcend the familiar physical or relational rhythms that we have kind of sized up as 21st century normal. Ultreia. I yearn to go beyond what we've known so far. I just can sense God beckoning us. Hey, let's go further. Let's go beyond. Ultreia. Seems to be one little problem, though, with this whole ultreia idea. And that is that we find ourselves in this weird place Zach was just referencing a minute ago. I didn't know Zach was going to talk about this. And it goes something like this. You see, throughout all of Western history, Westerners have understood that differing perspectives are actually essential components of the path of wisdom. Yeah? Next slide. We have widely embraced. Okay, let's go one more slide. Yeah, we'll come back to that at the end. Westerners we've always recognized that any one of us can only see part of anything, and what we do see is limited to our little bitty perspective. And so we benefit by taking in the perspectives of others. Like it's the essential way for us to move forward or to understand anything in its entirety. We've got to take in multiple perspectives. But today, we find ourselves in a different situation. Today, differing perspectives function more like dueling dogmas. And we seem to be a culture that's very much wrought with, I like this virus idea, with this, we're infected with this idea that a differing perspective is somehow anathema or wrong or maybe even dangerous. Now, I think this is a relatively new phenomenon for us as a culture. The last decade or so is when I see this really taking root. I think we've been infected with a virus that's actually much more severe and debilitating than any kind of biological virus we've ever known before, is this particular problem. It's a very particular problem. This notion that now we can no longer tolerate differing perspectives with each other. Now, not only do we have differing perspectives, but now there seems to be like a litmus test for every single possible issue to measure where you are on like your particular color camp. And these litmus tests really function just to further divide, more definitively divide everybody. Is that really yellow enough? If that's not yellow, we're not going to... Now, what's interesting, this image speaks to me so much because what it shows is that like a single thing really does cast different shadows depending on which way the light is shining on it. And I found this to be so communicative to help me understand this world that we live in. How is it that you and I can see the world so differently? Now, the comedian Aziz Ansari helped me with this. Some of you shaking. In one of his first little comedy experiences post-pandemic, he had a small group, probably about the size of this room, this part right here. And the crowd was really giving heck to a person, a celebrity, who had made some decisions around the pandemic practices that the crowd found objectionable. And so the comedian Aziz, he said this name, and everybody kind of booed. And he goes, no, friends, don't go there. And this was sincere. It was beautiful. He said, you see, the thing is, that celebrity has just been a slave to a different algorithm than you. Get that? That person has just been enslaved by a different algorithm than you. And so he sees the world totally differently. I continue to be stunned by how differently some people see the world. But what I recognize is, that we each live in like our own little self-affirming echo chambers that just keep telling us the things we already believe to be true. And I think this is a problem that is relatively new, but it's a problem that we have to transcend if we, like those first century disciples, are ever going to exercise something like Ultreia. How do we get beyond this? And my question for us today, Chestnut Grove, is do we have the capacity to transcend this little problem right here at Chestnut Grove? A decade ago, we were really good at it. We seem to have been infected a little bit recently. How many of us are up for like transcending Team Yellow, Team Blue? Oh, God. Ultreia, let's transcend. Let's go beyond what we're knowing right now. Let's go beyond 21st century normal. So the question becomes then, well, so how do we do that? How do we transcend this and all the litmus tests that determine which side you're on? I found this modified image that I find to be super helpful in that, and that is that you and I refrain from looking at the shapes and the shadows of our color camps, and we return to gazing at the truth itself. How about that? We just turn our gaze from what our color camps are screaming. You see, these days, somebody the way it's working, is just as likely to claim themselves as a self-appointed expert on everything, every issue in the world, right? And they've got this really powerful black box of doom in their pocket so they can broadcast it on the global stage. And so they're likely to say something like this: our governor's an idiot. That congressman's a fool. Rather than, hey, I have read widely on this topic. I've carefully considered lots of opinions. And I believe there may be a more productive path forward than the way the governor is choosing right now. And I'd like to contribute to solving the problem. No, no. The governor's an idiot. And the yellow crowd erupts in affirmation. Let's transcend that, shall we? Can we move beyond that? Ultreia, the black box of doom. I love that. Somebody asked me yesterday if I had a TikTok, and I just kind of went, no, I've never had a TikTok. I'm so thankful I've never had a TikTok. The black box of doom. I wonder what damage these things are doing to us, even though they don't explode literally in our pockets. I wonder if it's worse. Slowed. We got a problem. Humanity has a problem right now, these dueling dogmas. So rather than focusing on the shadows and shapes cast by looking past the truth, I'd like us to look at the truth together as a community. Well, so how do we do that? Well, I have good news. There is a truth that has never changed that we can look at today, and that is God's mission in this world. God's mission in this world was the same a zillion years ago as it will be a zillion years from now. And I invite us to take a look at what that is. So what is God's mission in the world? Well, how many of you remember this? Anybody still have one of these placemat versions of this thing? Now we got this. This is 2008 vintage. This was the very first printing of this thing. And then we got a little more economical with this one. You like this one? Yeah. Well, this thing just happens to have on it, right at the top, God's mission. And so I want to share one with everyone. Brian, would you take those? Grant, would you pass out these? Take one, pass them around. John, I can count on you, yeah? Pass these around here. Amy? Oh, thanks so much. Here. And we'll give Luke this task. Let's say, yeah. He's both a musician and a paper passer-outer. He's really multi-talented. So how do we focus on truth instead of being preoccupied by what the messaging of Team Yellow and Team Blue are? And we, I think, have to redirect our gaze to the truth of God's mission in this world, which, like I said, was the same and always will be the same. God has always been about this same thing, no matter how much humanity gyrates and convulses or is victim of the wave of our little black boxes. God's mission remains exactly as it has always been. So what is God's mission, you ask? Well, handy enough, we printed it right there at the top of your card for you. God's mission is for the church, for us, to be the body of Christ, joining God in the redemptive work of restoring all people, maybe all creation, back to unity with God and each other. Whew. That's a good mission. That's what God has always been up to. God has always been up to this project of trying to restore and redeem and reunify all people and all people with God. All creation. God has always been interested in redeeming and restoring and reuniting. And so I would say to you that whatever the future might look like for us, if it's dissonant with restoring and reunion, it is not of God. If it's not part of a cosmic redemption process, it's just not of God. Now, sadly, God's people have a long and unflattering history of shirking God's mission, or rebelling against God's mission, or just outright rejecting God's mission for their own sense of security. Our cousins, our ancestors, started by worshiping a golden calf, right? That's evolved to now worshiping a bronze bull on Wall Street or something like that. Because it seems that we find our mission connected to that rather than to God. So what does it look like for us to turn our eyes back to like what God has always been up to? This project of redemption and restoration and reunion, you and me and us and God and us. You know that was Jesus' final prayer on this earth? Is God, can you please help them recognize that as you're in me, I'm in them, and they're in you, and we're all together in this thing? Can you please, God, help us? Can you help all humanity awaken to that recognition? This grand project of reunion and awakening to the union of us and God, divinity, humanity. Whew, that's God's mission. And that's a fresh copy, hot off the press this week for you to be reminded, for all of us together to be reminded what the future might look like. Now, let's reread that mission together, shall we? God's mission is for the church to be the body of Christ, joining God in the redemptive work of restoring all people, all creation, back to unity with God and each other. Well, in terms of moving forward or transcending or ultreia, the question comes, so it's like, where's this thing headed? If we're going to remember God's mission, where is it going? And what I would suggest to you is that the answer to that question is right there at the bottom of your card. We've called it the vision of our congregation. That when God's mission becomes manifest or comes into fruition, what does it look like? Well, it looks like this: a rejuvenating culture of maturing disciples who are liberating the world. Now, does that sound appealing to anybody? I'd like to be on that team. A rejuvenating culture of maturing disciples who are liberating everybody. When God's mission comes to fruition, we get something like this vision. This is what it looks like when God's will be's done on earth as in heaven. Is there's rejuvenation happening, and there's transformation. That goes with maturity. And there's liberation happening. People are getting free. All kinds of people in all kinds of ways. Well, great, Pastor. We know God's mission. We know what it looks like when it comes into being. So how do we get there? And that's a really good question. And thankfully, once again, you and I don't have to make up the answer to this. You see, God has crafted a plan for us to be the church, to join God in the way that God wants us to join. Now, throughout history, at least the last 2,000 years, the church has known about the 5, what I would call the universal functions of a church. Like, what is a church to do in this world? And those things aren't up for debate for us. They're just what God has appointed to us as responsibilities or as undertakings or as endeavors, or as I might substitute instead, as the delicious different dishes in an everlasting, deeply rejuvenating feast of life. These 5 functions of worship, proclamation, education, fellowship, and ministry. And I know that sounds kind of boring. Rick Warren first made them familiar to the church, I think, in the 1990s. But this has always been what God has assigned the church to do. This is how we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to move in this world. And you say, well, you know, Pastor, I don't really like going to worship very much. And I would say, well, okay, well, let's talk about that. Because if you don't like it, it's probably something connected to the fact that you don't understand it, actually. Or you've misapplied it. Or, I don't really like discipleship. I don't like being made new. And what I would say about that is like, well, have you ever become good at something before? And recognized how much more life-giving it is to be good at something than to be terrible at something? And how good it is for everybody else when you're good at something or competent at something rather than when you're flailing about? Quick example. How many of you really would like for me to start playing this instrument right now? How lovely would that be? No, but if I was as good as Luke, you'd probably say, yeah, bring it, would you? Because we're better when you're doing your thing. You've been transformed into a mandolin player, perhaps, instead of a whatever that was. So, just really quick, I want to remind us, these are not yoga positions whereby we have to strain and hold and sweat in order to do them well. If we have that ideology, we have misunderstood what these things are. These are the best dishes in a feast that rejuvenate and nourish us in deep kinds of ways when we understand what they are supposed to be about. So let's look at these just really quickly. So what about worship? Sorry, Luke, I played your instrument while you were gone. I don't think there's much competition. Yeah. I appreciate the time you've spent becoming proficient at this. I haven't done that yet. Yeah. So let's talk about worship. What is worship? Well, gosh, worship, I don't have to go and I have to do, and I got so many other things to do. Well, hey guys, guess what? Worship is actually the intentional setting aside of the pressures and the priorities of the other 6 days. It's an escape from all of those things so that you can come and participate in some sort of like metaphysical and spiritual rejuvenation. How many of you have had enough of the 6 days? Cramming in and completing your 7th, yeah? I can't come to church, I have too much to do. And I'm going to say, no, get free from that and partake in some kind of practices whereby you're becoming newly alive. That's what worship is for, right? Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Don't let it get infected by the other 6 days' pressures and priorities such that you're incapacitated and you don't have any spiritual life left in you. Worship is a celebration. And whenever you and I are participating in a celebration of sorts, there's new life coming into us. It may not always be happy and joyous, because sometimes what we need for rejuvenation is more quiet and contemplative. But we have to get rejuvenated somehow, and that's what worship is all about. And it's a gift that God has given the church that says, hey, don't ever forsake this thing or you'll die. Worship. I've given it to you so that I can keep pumping new life into you over and over and over again. Worship. All right, well, how about this next one? Proclamation. Here's proclamation. God so loves humanity that God sent the Son not to condemn humanity, but that humanity might be saved. That's great news, isn't it? Because you're humanity, right? And proclamation, sometimes called evangelism, sometimes called the kerygma, which is the good news in Greek, is the good news that God so loves all of the people, yellow and blue, all of them. God so loves that God would never long to condemn, but God only came that you might have life and have it abundantly. Doesn't that seem like good news? Yeah, that's what the church is supposed to keep saying in this world, is like, oh, God loves you, all of you. Yellow, blue, yellow, blue, yellow, blue. How about education or discipleship, as we call it? Mathetes is the word Jesus used. It's the Greek. It talks about being transformed. I shot my first deer yesterday. Oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't a very positive thing for some of you. I got local groceries yesterday. I got homegrown meat, like it says local, farm fresh, homegrown as can be. I've eliminated one deer terrorist from your yard, so your hosta and azaleas will survive from at least that one deer. And I'm going to bring some of it tonight for dinner, actually. Some of you are like, oh, I'll watch for that. Yeah. But the fact is, I am only about 4 years into this bow hunting thing, but my posture yesterday when it comes time to engage in that act is way different than it was the first time I went out. The first time I went out with my cup of coffee, which was so aromatic that the deer stayed 100 yards away. My deodorant, Speed Stick, which was like aromatic, and the deer were like, we're not coming within a mile of you. Now I know the things to do, and now I experience a level of success and joy in the act that I just couldn't get access to at first. But it's why? Because I allowed myself to be transformed. I allowed someone to become my teacher. I humbled myself and recognized, oh, I don't know everything there is to know, so maybe I can learn if I allow a teacher to teach me some things. Jesus was all about helping people become transformed so that their whole life would be successful. Everything about how they related to their spouse, how they related to their friends, how they did their work, how they treated their enemy, how yellow treated blue. Jesus speaks to that, Like I can give you life and give it abundantly. It's not just when you die. It's like now, always. But we got to be transformed in this kind of way. Education is the church's task. How do we disciple, teach, and equip these little ones? Did you see all these little people up here this morning singing? Interestingly, they were changing me this morning. I think is more than I'm changing them. But that's how it works when we do this fourth thing, and that is the function of community or fellowship. You see, this Christian thing has always been a function of interdependence and unity and connection together. Koinonia is the Greek word that talks about this kind of community whereby we can be honest with each other. We could even take our shoes off with each other. We could even tell each other the things we're struggling with. I had a visitor in town this week that I struggled with, and we've talked some about that. And a couple of you called me this week to say, hey, how are you doing? And it felt like we transcended the previous relational norms that we had had because somebody thought to call me and ask me about it. And I loved it so much. It was so beautiful. And I had a great week, incidentally. Thank you for all of you who checked in on me this week. But some of that was because somehow in relationships with you, I'm learning how to be better in relationships with others, including the folks that I've struggled with in the past. Maybe the folks who have struggled with me in the past. I'm getting better at it, and my life is getting better because I'm in community with you, and we're learning how to do relationships better. Maybe instead of fighting, we come to the table, and that's how we fight our battles. In fact, I went to the table twice with my guest this week. A lot of love can happen, even if it's cumbersome. It's better. Fellowship. Christianity is a solo sport exactly as much as baseball. Now, you can go to the batting cages, right? You can even throw in a pitchback and have it pitch back to you, but you can never play baseball without being in community with a team. Christianity cannot be done solo. It's only done in community with each other. Koinonia or fellowship is the function of the church. Do you know, I think Zach said this also this morning. Zach, I didn't give you an advanced copy of this, but you were on it. You were ahead of me. You know there's a loneliness epidemic right now in the United States? Maybe other places too. Maybe a pandemic, actually. A loneliness pandemic. Do you know what the remedy to loneliness is? Community. Community is like God's gift to hedge off loneliness. It's a solution to rugged hyper-individualism that leaves us alone, all by ourselves. Community. We're really good, I think, as a church at practicing community. And if you come back for dinner tonight, I'm going to bring you some dinner. So we can have community. We can break chili together tonight. There'll be other options. The final or fifth function that God has given the church is that we might do ministry, or diakonos is the word. It means to serve. You see, the church is the voice that keeps telling us that you actually find vitality when you give vitality to something else. The church is the one that says, she finds life when she gives her life away. That's when you find aliveness inside of you. Aliveness is not to be hoarded and kept all to myself and protected from everybody else. We're to engage in this thing of giving life to each other. And we find that, it's so much better when we do, yeah? It's the gift of us to the world, is this practice of ministry, a self-emptying kind of thing. I think it was Paul who said the measure you use in that regard will be the measure by which it's given back to you, pressed down, shaken up, spilling over, and overflowing, or something like that, yeah? So how are we doing on that? Are we loving and giving ourselves to others in that kind of a way, whereby it's getting shaped up? Worship, proclamation, education, community, ministry. What does ultreia mean when it comes to those things? What does this mean for us? What does it look like, Chestnut? I don't know what it looks like. I'm telling you, I don't know. But I long for us as a community to transcend what we've thought those things are, because those things are continually in motion. To review really quickly here, God's mission hasn't ever changed, and it's not going to change. The vision of what it looks like isn't going to change, because even if we use different vocabulary, it isn't going to change, because God's movement through the church always brings about rejuvenation and transformation and liberation. Those things aren't up for debate. And even what we do, worship, education, fellowship, ministry, discipleship, those things aren't going to change. That's what God gave the church to do. However, the means by which and the methods we employ absolutely must change. Why? Because humanity and community are continuously evolving projects, right? How many of you heat up popcorn the same way now as you did 30 years ago? No, that's a simple one, right? Yeah. How many of you get to work using exactly the same roads and pathways that you used to get to work even 5 years ago? We're just always moving and evolving, and thus we got to figure out how to do it differently now, right? So Chestnut Grove, here's the question for the next decade. How do we find a faithful future together? Oh, come on, kiddos. You guys, I saved your seat. If you want, you can come right back here or sit with your folks on their laps. I also found that Luke's lap is pretty good to sit on. If you need a place to sit, you can just sit right here. Yeah. Friends, the question for us for the next 6 weeks is how will we find our way into a future that looks like Ultreya, transcending what we've known? Katie, can you go back to the slide there at the top? I think we've got a finding our faithful future together. We'll come back to this place in a minute, but yeah. Friends, for the next 6 weeks, and here you've already been at a 100% attendance at these 6 weeks. For the next 6 weeks, we're gathering in the morning, and then we're coming back in the evening to explore some of these things together, because they keep evolving with time. They have to keep evolving with time. I don't know exactly what it looks like moving forward, but I believe that God will show us what it looks like as we practice these things together. Back to where we were, Katie, really quick. Now, in 2008, we came up with a simple, alliterative, easy to remember kind of shorthand for what it looks like to do all this stuff, to be people of faith and formation. And yeah, again, 2008, we invented that language. And about 2013, we condensed it. We kept the same vocabulary, but we condensed it so it was a little more portable. I just gave you one, and guess what? This backside, which year after year after year said, this is how we're going to do it, guess what? Look at yours. That's what we're going to write together. For the next 6 weeks, you and I, in the mornings in here, and in the evenings over dinner, are going to engage in some group activities together. Nobody's going to be put on the spot. Everybody's going to have a chance to contribute. It will be safe. Introverts will be safe. You don't have to talk out loud. So that we can explore and prayerfully do so, asking the question, well, what is God calling us to? How is God calling us to be in the future? Because you see, even though a lot of this doesn't ever change, again, our means have to change. The practices and the rhythms, they must change because humanity keeps evolving. Somebody asked me this week, hey, what do you guys do for Wednesday night prayer meeting at your church? And I went, oh. I thought a lot of things like, well, first, I'm sorry for your luck that you still have to do. No. I thought we actually ceased that rhythm because it was no longer effective. It had become kind of a takeout diner. You know, people were coming in to get their to-go boxes and then going home. That serves a function. It's just not one of the church's functions, really. And so it turned out to not be exactly where we were resonating and finding aliveness together. We've done that lots of times over the last 20 years. We've set some things aside because they don't make sense really for us as a community anymore, and it's time to do that again. I don't know what we're going to set aside, but together we're going to listen. How is it that we're finding things like rejuvenation? How are we finding maturity? How am I being transformed? I've said before, if you're not being transformed, please stop trying to transform other people. Please. You see, When God moves through God's people, there is always rejuvenation. There's always transformation. There's always liberation in the world, but those things evolve. And here's what I'm talking about. If we look back at the history of liberating the world, next slide, we will find that it's looked a lot of different ways. For example, how many of you were alive in the middle of the 19th century? The way the church facilitated liberation in the middle of the 19th century had to do with the fact that one entire race of people were violently coerced into chattel slavery. The church had a role in setting them free. If you go to the late 19th century and early 20th century, we find that women were not trusted to think or vocalize opinions or vote. But later, the church got involved and helped those women and that whole race of people become liberated. And when both of those groups became liberated, the whole world got better. Those previously stuck people got liberated to live bigger and more beautiful and more important lives. If it weren't for the church, neither of those things would have happened. Now, those liberties have been codified in documents now by the law of our country that they get to protect those liberties. The church has something to do with that. That's what it looks like. It continues to evolve, how it looks to liberate humanity. Liberation always has to do with which people or groups are being held back or held down by either their sin or the structure of society or the dynamics of relational systems. But whatever that looks like, it's the church's job to help set them free from that. What will liberation look like moving forward? I don't know exactly. Who's being held back right now? Who's being held down? I particularly think illiteracy is a humongous problem. It will curse kids for not just their generation, but their children's generation to a life of much, much less if they cannot read. What's it look like to address that? I don't know all the way, but we're trying to figure it out a little bit. There are probably other things, people who need to be liberated in all kinds of new sorts of ways. All right, one more. Maturing disciples. What does it look like for us to be continuously transformed? Well, guess what? It's looked different all through history. If you go back to Jesus' day, he picked 12 and he lived round the clock with them, and every aspect of their life was being continually transformed because he was modeling, oh, this is how you do this, actually. This is how you do this. But if you go to the 4th century, Jesus wasn't there anymore. And we find that instead, people decided to live in these kind of isolated and segregated communities where they were mitigating the strong influence of culture in order that they may continue to be transformed in their own priorities and their practices. It looked different. If we go to early American history, we find that suddenly the classroom became the primary means or method by which we were attempting to transform people. So we had academies that were training people. If you look in the 21st century to see what is the frontier of how disciples are being made, it's moved from the academy to the farm. Agriculture and natural settings are now the front edge of how disciples are being led into holistic transformation, because by seeing nature, now we can see God in whole new kinds of ways. And last week I told you about the miracle of every leaf in the world that I'm only just now awakening to. But a quick example of that, I went to a seminary that was all about the academy, prestigious folks, doctors in funny hats, the whole deal. That seminary has closed, and what many of those professors have gone to is now they work for a seminary called Sophia, which is a farm. It's a farm-based disciple-making institute where they're making disciples who will make disciples. How we do it keeps on changing, but we keep on going into transformation, right? So finally, and this is where I'm going to close for today, I'm most interested in this part right now. What does it look like to be a culture of rejuvenation? Do you know what rejuvenation means? I didn't figure you did. Well, means to do something over again, right? And juven is the word for youth. So when we say rejuvenate, it kind of means re-youthify. Re-youthify. So how is it that when you and I, who are not so young anymore, when we come together, how is it that we can be rejuvenated? Because that's what we're about. That's the project of the church, is to rejuvenate people. So how does that look? I don't know exactly. But if you come back tonight, we're going to eat and we're going to explore that. What does rejuvenation look like for you individually? What are we finding about how we find rejuvenation these days? What does it look like for you to be kind of pressed down, shaken up, and spilling over with new kinds of vitality? That's our project for tonight, exploring rejuvenation. About halfway through the Camino de Santiago, Tanya and I met a very interesting little man named Brother Carlos. Brother Carlos was in this ancient Spanish church, a tiny little place. He was a peculiar little hermit, and he was literally breathing new aliveness in the pilgrims or pellegrinos who would walk past this church, calling them in, caring for them. His whole life was set up to breathe spiritual and physical rejuvenation into people as they were passing by. We spent about a half hour with Carlos, and it was like drinking from a cold fountain with this guy. He asked all these tender questions about Tanya and me. And he got really excited that we were celebrating our 29th wedding anniversary on the pilgrimage route together. And then Carlos prayed for us, and we just wept. Carlos also prayed for this other person, Sandy, you see here. Sandy is a solo traveler, and she was a psychology professor. She is a psychology professor at Wheaton University. It's a Christian school. Sandy almost didn't come on the Camino because she had chronic shoulder injury and knee injury. Well, Carlos prayed for Sandy, and Sandy gently fell to the floor. They helped her down. And Carlos was praying these word-like sounds over her. And Sandy later shared that she just had this image while Carlos was praying of being held like a baby in God's arms. And God was just washing her. It was interesting. When Sandy and Tanya and I left that place, we walked for the next several hours together and we traded stories. And Sandy isn't charismatic. She's not Pentecostal. She's not accustomed to the things that were happening in that space, and neither were Tanya and I. But when we were walking away from there, we were all deeply moved by whatever kind of rejuvenation had just happened. Because not only did Tanya and I feel refreshed walking on a hot day, but Sandy's knee and shoulder had been seemingly completely restored. No pain at all. And we all kind of looked at each other like, why should we be doubting that this is possible? Why does this seem so odd that when you encounter a holy person like this that you might experience rejuvenation? Friends, the fact is, whenever you and I get into the presence of God together, rejuvenation is the fruit of that project. On a hot and dusty path a long, long time ago, another woman experienced a similarly surprising rejuvenation. She'd walked there alone also. She was riddled with invisible injuries, where she too encountered a peculiar faith-filled man in an old holy place. Like Sandy, that woman was really well informed in her religious tradition. She was probably not open to previously unheard of ideas. She already knew all the traditions and the stories. But as this woman tarried there with this faith-filled guy, he began to suggest to her some new ideas that she hadn't heard before. New possibilities like perhaps your past doesn't have to define your future. Ultreya. Perhaps the limiting shackles that you've been experiencing could be transcended to a new kind of freedom. Perhaps even there's a new vitality beyond what your religious community has already known. The woman wasn't so sure about all this. She resisted a bit at first. But it was in that moment that the faith-filled man went on to say that if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked and he would have given you living water. New idea. She began to resist, kind of list all the reasons why, no, that's not possible. Oh, but if you only knew, but there's all this other stuff. At that moment, the faithful man just pressed right on through and continued to say that those who drink of the water that I give them will never be thirsty. The water that I give them will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life. Rejuvenation. When you and I immerse ourselves in the presence of God, rejuvenation, new aliveness is the product. Chestnut Grove, this is the very thing that God longs to give all of humanity, is this new kind of aliveness. That's why he's come to be with us. He gives us spiritual food, spiritual drink, so that we can be rejuvenated in the deep places. I pray that over these next 6 weeks, Chestnut Grove, you and I can explore together what does it look like for us to be rejuvenated. Hope you'll join us tonight.